Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get to your phone calls. Our Twitter poll today: should the courts have the authority to order the end of life-saving medical treatment? I gave you the specific example of an 8-month-old girl in Nottingham, England, who is being denied the right to continue to try to fight for her own life. Her parents have been denied that right as well, and now she's being sent off to die by order of a court. Is that the kind of world we live in now? Should the courts have the authority to order the end of life-saving medical treatment? I would say no. Today's Twitter poll can be found at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. On that note, I want to go to Norman Woods, who's director of a group located in South Dakota, is Family Voice. Ms. Woods, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we had all the pro-abortion groups. They like to call themselves pro-choice, but it really translates as pro-abortion. I happen to be pro-life, so I differ with them. But after the decision June of last year announced by the Supreme Court that Roe v. Wade was a giant mistake, which I think they were right about, that these groups now say, well, we want to put these into the Constitution of various states or into statute law one way or the other, because they want to create the right to abortion, so-called, that never actually existed in the Constitution. Have I got that about right?
Yep, that's what they're trying to do.
And what are we going to do to push back?
So here in South Dakota, let's start with what they're trying to do, and then we'll get to how do we push back.
Sure.
So the amendment that they're pushing here, I mean, it is radical. It's abortion through all 9 months, and parental rights would be totally eliminated. So in the first trimester especially, if a young girl has been coerced into an abortion, there'd be no notifying of the parents. And also in the first trimester, health and safety regulations completely gone. The state would not be able to ask any questions, any safety regulations or health standards. Was it done in a clinic? Was the clinic clean? Was it done by a doctor? Was the doctor in good standing? None of those questions can even be asked. So it's not exaggerating to say that abortion through the mail, vending machine abortion, all these different things, and killing of babies through all 9 months would be legal, enshrined in our South Dakota Constitution.
Now,
so starting off with, that's
are
what they're
South
trying to do.
Dakotans going to vote for that kind of thing, Mr. Woods? Because my perception, at least, of South Dakota, only having visited your state a couple of times, is that it's a relatively conservative or at least center-right kind of state.
Yes, it's definitely a pro-life leaning state. It's a red leaning state. If you compare the numbers to Ohio, where they just passed that, the really radical measure in spite of the fight against it. They went for Trump by 8%. South Dakota, it was over 26%. So it's a fairly conservative state, but it's all going to come down to, do people believe the lies of the left? Because they'll pour millions of dollars into a smear campaign lying about, this, that, and the other thing. So it's going to come down to, are we able to get the true message out of what this does? Or do people simply listen to the lies and the deceptive advertising?
Well, what do you think is going to happen? Because I've seen in my own backyard those kind of efforts by left-wing groups to pass things that were, after they were passed, people said, how did that ever happen? I said, well, when you got enough money and you pour it in many, many times from out of state, and I would expect that you're going to see a lot of money flow in from out of state to sell this in the state of South Dakota to the people of South Dakota. So is the decision really going to be up to the people of South Dakota, or is it up to interest groups from New York and Washington, D.C.?
I think if we look at other issues, we can see that it's still ours to win or ours to lose if we don't show up. The Bonhoeffer said, silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to act is to act, not to speak is to speak. And I think that's where we're at in South Dakota. We can win this. If you look at the numbers, South Dakota versus Ohio, and as discouraging as that was, we still have a clear path to victory if South Dakota citizens stand up, if national friends jump in with us. We still have a clear path to victory if we get the message out, because South Dakotans, they don't want abortion through all 9 months. They don't want women in the first trimester to be completely unprotected. So that's why groups like the Life Defense Fund have been so imperative, because we're already hitting the ground running, and we're already seeing success on the street corners when these petitioners are trying to lie to citizens, and another volunteer simply stands nearby and says, hey, I also have other information if you'd like to learn more before you sign. Sometimes that's all they need to know is, wait a second, there's two sides, and suddenly they're not just roped into signing it.
I'm talking to Norman Woods, who's director of the group called SD Family Voice, which is South Dakota Family Voice. See, this is the part that I just don't understand. From a distance, you've got, as you said, it's a radical proposal to say, let's put into the Constitution the requirement that abortion can be done right up to the moment of birth. And I know, the elites and the liberals in America love to compare things to Europe. Europe has some limits that are either more conservative than places like Mississippi, where the Dobbs case came out of, or they're either no more limiting or even more limiting than what Mississippi did. And yet that was cast as this is a radical limitation, 15 weeks. You say, well, 15 weeks is more liberal on abortion than most of Europe is. If you like those comparisons, let's compare that. How about some limitations at least? And are they trying to solve a problem that isn't really a problem in South Dakota right now? Is there a problem that a young woman who says, I want to get an abortion, is she able to do that in the state of South Dakota now?
Well, no. Right now, the only time abortion is legal is if a doctor believes that it's necessary to save her life.
Right. So that's only
Right.
2 to 3%, as I understand the numbers, maybe 2 or 3% of all abortions are performed, at least allegedly, to save the life of the mother. But if she wants to travel to obtain the abortion, there are ways she can travel. You don't have to force this down the throats of the people of that state.
Right. And that's one thing you're seeing here. You mentioned the lies of the left. Actually, the Attorney General here in South Dakota recently sent a letter to the proponents of this measure saying, hey, we have evidence that you are misrepresenting this. We have evidence that you are telling people they can sign more than once, which is illegal. And we have evidence that you're leaving petitions unattended. So the Attorney General has warned them that, hey, I have evidence that you're breaking the law. You need to stop with the deception and stop claiming that this is something that it isn't.
How many signatures is it going to take to put this on the ballot to change the Constitution?
They need 35,000. They're claiming they already have the minimum, but we know there's going to be a whole bunch that aren't valid, so they haven't reached their goal yet. They're claiming that they've met the bare minimum of 35,000, but they want to turn in more because they need to turn in a whole lot more if they're actually going to get on the ballot.
And how much more time do they have to gather those?
Till next spring.
Okay, so they
Yep,
have a
the
good
deadline was
long
really pushed
timeline
back.
from their point of view.
Yes, from their point of view, unfortunately, they do, and that's all a recent change. We can get into the story of how that happened, but that's another story for another day.
How did that happen? Yeah. I'm curious about that because it seems like a fairly low threshold.
Right. So we used to have a really strong threshold of 12 months in advance. It was struck down by a court saying that was a little bit too strict, and there was mention made of basically 5 months. And so the legislature, they didn't want to fight. They didn't want the possibility of another lawsuit someday, so they went basically as loose as they could just to avoid a potential fight again, which really left the door wide open for them to collect more signatures.
All right. And at that point, have you, I guess, resigned yourself to the idea that it probably will be on the ballot, but then it'll be up to your groups like yours to persuade voters not to approve it?
I think there's multiple avenues that we're still fighting. We're still educating people on the street corners of what they're actually signing. That's been effective. So there's the possibility they don't even turn in enough signatures that are valid. Once they do turn them in, we can examine them as well because it's an open process to make sure that they were legitimate signatures. So you've got step 1, step 2. So if it gets to step 3 on the ballot, no, I'm not resigned that it's a done deal, that it will get on the ballot, not at all. But even if it does get on the ballot, we still have that third avenue to fight, and we still have a path forward to victory.
I mean, because the thing I always think about, Mr. Woods, is if the representatives of a people of a state say, we don't want abortion at all, it would stun me if putting to a public vote would lead to a vote in favor of some of the most unrestricted abortion anywhere in America.
Right. If you only hear one side of the story, which is why we've seen a clear pathway forward to victory. If we can get enough people together and enough resources together, we've got a clear path to victory if everybody stands up and points out what this really is.
Well, let's hope that they do. Mr. Woods, Norman Woods is the director of the group SD Family Voice, South Dakota Family Voice. Mr. Woods, we appreciate your time. Coming up in a moment, Republicans vote to slash the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, to $1 a year in salary. We'll get to that next.